Welcome to Oligarchy, the inevitable reversion. The gravity of power and the logic of reversion. In every age, power begins its ascent with a promise. It offers order where there was uncertainty, coordination where there was chaos. It presents itself as the only structure capable of holding complexity together, and for a time, it delivers. Roads are built, systems synchronize, and the scattered threads of society are drawn into a single weave. But with each knot tied at the center, something else begins to tighten. What begins as coordination becomes consolidation. Decision-making narrows, alternatives disappear. Systems that once breathed with the rhythm of human life begin to harden around a single logic. And as that logic grows more absolute, it also grows more brittle. This is not an aberration, it is a pattern. Power, once centralized, does not remain static. It accumulates, it reinforces, and in doing so, it destabilizes the very ground it was meant to steady. Like mass in a gravitational field, the more that is drawn inward, the more the surrounding structures bend to its weight, until the field itself begins to distort. Eventually, that weight becomes unsustainable. The center no longer holds, it consumes. Complexity can no longer be managed, only suppressed. What once promised stability begins to produce imbalance. And from that imbalance, a deeper instability emerges, not just of politics or economy, but of meaning, of trust, of structure itself. This is the arc beneath every unraveling, a slow drift from centralization through imbalance into instability, not in metaphor but in system dynamics, not as failure, but as feedback. Yet instability is not collapse. It is exposure. It reveals the artificial equilibrium that held everything in place, and it invites something else not yet present but gathering. What rises in the wake of over-centralization is not necessarily rebellion. It is reversion, not as a violent reaction, but as a systemic tendency toward restoration. Reversion is misunderstood. It is not revolution in the romantic sense. It is not idealistic or even voluntary. It is structural. It is what happens when a system, distorted beyond self-correction, begins to seek new points of balance. Reversion does not guarantee justice or improvement. It merely opens the field. It clears the saturated center and invites the margins to speak. We are living through such a moment now. The attempt to centralize planetary governance, to bind all coordination to a handful of platforms, currencies and institutions, is nearing its threshold. The systems built to manage life, markets, bureaucracies, digital infrastructure are no longer adapting to human needs. They are adapting only to their own survival, and in doing so, they have become maladaptive. That maladaptation is the signal of instability. It appears first as friction, failing institutions, incoherent policies, collapsing trust. Then as fatigue, people withdrawing, disconnecting, refusing to participate. Finally, it shows itself as divergence, the return of alternatives, the emergence of other logics, not imposed but discovered. What comes next is not certain. Reversion does not determine outcomes, it clears constraints. It creates the conditions for emergence. Whether that emergence takes the form of renewal or regression depends on what people understand and what they build. And that is where this work begins. This is not a chronicle of collapse. It is a manual for coherence. It is not about what breaks, but about how to see the system breaking and what that break reveals. Because systems do not fall without a trace. They fall along fault lines. They collapse along the very structures they once used to maintain order. If we can learn to read those lines, if we can understand how centralization breeds imbalance, how imbalance gives way to instability, then we can begin to map what comes after. Not from ideology, but from pattern. Not from belief, but from logic. That logic is not linear, it is relational, it moves in triads. The structures collapsing around us will not wait for full understanding, but they will yield to those who understand how systems interrelate, how logic flows, how truth is structured, and how a different world can be composed not from slogans but from wisdom. And the first triad is this. Centralization leads to imbalance. Imbalance leads to instability. This is not the end of a system. It is the condition for its transformation. From instability, new centers can form, not singular, but distributed, not imposed from above, but arising from below. Decentralization, balance, stability. So let us begin where all such cycles begin, with the consolidation of power. Oligarchic consolidation. All empires begin with a promise that order can be restored, that chaos can be contained, and that those with vision and strength will stabilize what others have broken. But behind the facade of order lies a deeper pattern, a logic that repeats itself across time and systems. It is not the logic of stability, but of reinforcement through control, where power does not simply govern, but restructures reality to preserve itself. This pattern always begins with instability. Whether by accident or design, markets are thrown into confusion. Institutions begin to wobble. Trade flows are disrupted, prices rise, supply chains snap, and entire populations are forced to reassess the very ground beneath their lives. Fear enters quietly at first, through higher grocery bills, through delayed goods, through the soft panic of uncertainty, but it never leaves quietly. Fear hardens into dependency. This is not a new story. In our present moment, we have watched this cycle unfold with stunning speed. When the United States imposed sweeping tariffs, most notably a 145% duty on Chinese imports, it was framed as a strategy to strengthen national self-reliance. But its deeper consequence was economic turbulence, a contraction in GDP, rising inflation, and a sudden surge in import costs that struck businesses and households alike. Far from correcting a failing system, the move further destabilized it. But this instability did not harm all equally. It had a design. For those with resources and connections, instability is not a threat, but an opportunity. When rules change rapidly, those who write them, or who have access to those who do, hold the advantage. And so begins the second movement of the triad crony capitalism. This is not a corruption of the market system. It is the market system under the influence of concentrated power. When businesses can no longer succeed on merit, they turn to influence. And when the state rewards those who align and punishes those who do not, the economy becomes a stage for political loyalty. In this environment, entire sectors begin to reorganize around the whims of power. Legal firms, traditionally viewed as independent and grounded in principle, are suddenly compelled to align ideologically or face exclusion from public contracts. Companies invest less in innovation and more in lobbying, knowing that proximity to power now outweighs excellence. The logic of value is inverted. Success no longer flows from capability, but from compliance, and compliance pays handsomely. As the market is reshaped by crony relationships, wealth begins to pool in familiar places. The upper strata, already advantaged, find themselves in an environment of exponential gain. With fewer obstacles, lower taxes, and privileged access, they do not merely grow rich, they consolidate wealth on a scale that transforms society. This is not incidental. It is the fulfillment of the logic set in motion by instability and sustained by favoritism. But the most dangerous feature of this process is its self-reinforcing nature. As wealth concentrates, so too does influence. Those who command capital shape policy. Those who shape policy reinforce capital, and as that loop tightens, the system becomes impervious to reform and blind to the reality outside its own bubble. It sees instability not as a threat, but as useful pressure that forces the rest of society to accept what is offered because nothing else is available. This triad, instability, cronyism, concentration, does not simply explain how we arrived here. It explains why things keep getting worse for those outside the loop and better for those within. It is not a flaw in the system, it is the system. But like all tightly wound systems, it contains the seeds of its own collapse. As power accumulates at the top, the foundation beneath it is hollowed out. The majority are pushed out of ownership, out of decision-making, out of participation itself. And in that exclusion, a counter-pressure begins to build, not yet a revolution but a negation. The more a system requires compliance to function, the more unstable it becomes the moment people begin to refuse. What we are witnessing is not just inequality, it is the final stage of a consolidation process that can no longer pretend to be for the benefit of the many. And in that recognition lies the turn. The logic that built this order, centralizing, extracting, suppressing, cannot adapt to life outside its control. It cannot scale down, it cannot decentralize, it can only enforce, and in that enforcement, it overreaches. Identity binding and the illusion of control. Power, once consolidated, seeks permanence. It cannot be content to simply dominate markets or accumulate wealth. It must render that dominance unchallengeable. It must ensure that every individual is legible to the system, every action measurable, and every deviation punishable. To do this, power turns to its final instrument, the binding of identity to participation. In the present unfolding of oligarchic consolidation, this mechanism has taken the form of centralized identity systems, most visibly through the integration of social security numbers, biometric data, and AI-driven administrative enforcement. The idea is not new, but the execution is unprecedented. What began as a means of administrative coordination has become the linchpin of a new form of social control, one in which access to the economy, government services, education, even movement itself, is contingent on a single, centrally issued marker of legitimacy. This identity, whether in the form of a digital ID, facial recognition record, or algorithmically verified status, is presented as a tool of convenience. The language surrounding it is always managerial fraud prevention, efficiency, streamlining, modernization. But behind these words lies a deeper architecture, one built not to serve individuals but to render them accountable to systems they do not control. When your ability to eat, to work, or to travel depends on a database you cannot question and an algorithm you cannot appeal to, you are no longer a citizen. You are a record. The rollout of such systems has coincided predictably with the gutting of the federal workforce and the rise of AI as a surrogate for judgment. Agencies once staffed by civil servants now function under the logic of automation, faster, cheaper, less human. The Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, tasked with implementing these changes, has reduced tens of thousands of roles to lines of code. Oversight has withered. Human discretion has been replaced with machine protocol. A generation of public-facing systems, social security, tax assistance, student loan servicing, has been handed to algorithms. And yet, this transformation is not experienced equally. Those already marginalized, the poor, the elderly, the digitally excluded, are the first to suffer. For them, automation is not efficiency, but disappearance, a missed update, an unscanned form, a misclassified status, and their lives are frozen. No aid, no appeal, no explanation. They do not receive denials, they receive silence. Their identity is not validated, and so they no longer exist in the system's eyes. This is the hidden cruelty of identity binding, its ability to erase without violence. There are no soldiers, no raids, just an access-denied message on a screen. The system, having made itself the sole channel for participation, has also made itself the sole arbiter of reality. You are what it says you are, or you are nothing. But no system can sustain such pressure without rupture. As exclusions grow, so too does public distrust. People begin to sense that the tools meant to serve them are being used against them. They begin to censor themselves, not out of legal fear, but practical necessity. A tweet, a protest, a comment overheard by the wrong software agent, and suddenly the system grows cold. Travel applications stall, bank transfers get flagged, opportunities vanish without explanation. Fear becomes the medium of daily life, and submission the currency of stability. And yet, within this climate of control, the first cracks appear. Individuals begin refusing. Some opt out of biometric scans at airports, others return to cash-only economies. Rural communities revive paper-based records and local credit networks. These acts are small, fragmented, and often ineffective. But they are not meaningless. They are the first expressions of a deeper recognition that the system no longer serves the people, and so the people must begin to serve each other. This shift is not yet a movement. It is still nascent, still searching for form. But as it spreads, a new logic begins to emerge. The centralized identifier, once seen as a passkey to opportunity, is increasingly viewed as a shackle, a mark of control, not freedom. People begin to ask whether legitimacy itself can be redefined, not as a license issued from above, but as recognition earned from below, from community, from trust, from mutual aid. Herein lies the irony at the heart of the system's ambition. The more total its control becomes, the more brittle it grows. A system that binds all participation to a single point of verification becomes exquisitely vulnerable. It cannot tolerate rejection because it has no backup. It cannot tolerate error because it has no grace. And it cannot tolerate mass divergence because the very scale that gave it power becomes the instrument of its collapse. As more and more people are excluded by accident, by dissent, or by simple non-compliance, the demand for alternatives intensifies. Barter networks reappear. Local currencies are printed. Families begin sharing food, goods, labour outside official channels without permission. These new systems are imperfect. They are clumsy, inefficient, slow, but they are alive, and they are free. At first, the centralised order sees these acts as insignificant, but each workaround is a seed, each refusal is a thread, and soon the edges begin to unravel. When identity is no longer the only path to participation, the system loses its monopoly, not through attack, but through irrelevance. It still exists, but its authority no longer commands belief. The identifier, once intended to unite all systems into a seamless architecture of control, becomes the point at which the system is breached. It becomes a symbol not of order but of distance, from truth, from justice, from the people themselves. And in that recognition lies the next phase of reversion. We are not yet through the fire. The collapse of legitimacy does not automatically yield liberation. It can lead to panic, to fragmentation, even to new forms of domination. But it also opens space. It reveals the emptiness at the core of the old structure and invites the work of building something better, not through conquest, but through relation. The question now is not whether the system will fall, it is whether we will be ready to meet what comes after. Systemic overreach and reversion. Every system built on extraction eventually reaches for totality. Power, once concentrated, does not rest. It extends, rationalizes, and refines itself until there are no spaces left ungoverned. And yet, the closer a regime draws to total control, the more brittle it becomes. This is not a paradox. It is the logical end of centralization. It does not break from outside. It collapses under the weight of its own certainty. Oligarchic power does not merely want to dominate the economy. It wants to define reality. Its impulse is not just to rule, but to render itself indispensable, to be the thing through which all else must pass. That's why the machinery of control must tighten. Once markets are captured, identity must be captured. Once identity is bound, behavior must be shaped. And once all behavior is captured, belief itself must be regulated, lest someone, somewhere, begin to wonder whether this is all there is. This is the logic of overreach, and it is not a bug in the system, it is the system. It is the natural result of a structure that treats human beings not as co-creators, but as units in a schema, nodes in a network, records in a database. The central regime tells itself that the more precise its measurements, the more predictive its models, the more efficient its automation, the more perfect its order will become, but the very desire for total knowledge produces blindness. The system becomes so optimized for control that it can no longer comprehend complexity. It forgets that it is governing people, not data. It forgets that life resists simplification, and then it begins to break. We are already seeing this. The very systems designed to streamline governance, AI automation, digital ID verification, centralized regulation have begun to malfunction, not because of technical failure, but because they are built on a flawed premise that society can be governed as if it were a machine. When an elderly citizen is locked out of their benefits because they failed a biometric scan, the system does not see a crisis, it sees efficiency. When a student's financial aid is revoked because their paperwork didn't match the new AI-authenticated standard, there is no appeal, only a clean audit trail. These exclusions are not glitches, they are features. The system is doing exactly what it was built to do, enforce rules without context. But the more tightly it binds, the more people it leaves behind. And these people do not disappear, they adapt, they turn away. At first, the response is fragmented. A few communities begin trading locally. Some refuse facial scans, others create barter groups, mutual aid, cash-only circles. These actions seem small, even quaint, but they are not protests. they are exits. And every exit chips away at the illusion that the centralized system is indispensable. As this divergence accelerates, something deeper shifts. Legitimacy begins to crack. The system still functions, but people no longer believe in it. They comply not out of trust, but out of fear. They navigate the maze not to participate, but to survive. This is the first movement of reversion, the recognition that the system is no longer just and therefore no longer binding. People may still be caught in its grip, but they no longer grant it authority in their minds. Once this legitimacy dissolves, the second movement begins: disconnection. Without belief, participation becomes burdensome. Citizens stop engaging, stop reporting, stop relying. They opt out of official channels. They work off books. They trade in kind. They support one another not because of policy incentives, but because there's no one else left to turn to. The system, having hollowed out every structure but its own, finds itself unable to respond to the very instability it created. Then the third movement completes the reversion, the concentration of wealth and authority, once the system's greatest achievement becomes its final liability. A society where power flows only to the top cannot respond from the ground. It cannot hear, it cannot see. And so when the people act, when they leave, when they build something else, when they refuse, the system cannot adjust, it can only double down. But now every attempt to reassert control only deepens the fracture. The loop breaks. The logic eats itself. This is the triad of reversion. When people no longer believe, they stop obeying. When they stop obeying, the system destabilizes. When the system destabilizes, it lashes out and confirms the people's rejection. What follows from that breaking is not predetermined. Reversion is not revolution. It is not salvation. It is a release of pressure, a dissolution of form. It creates space, but not structure. And what fills that space depends entirely on what people are prepared to do when the old scaffolding falls away. In one version, what emerges is tragedy. Panic replaces planning, violence replaces coordination. Small groups rush to fill the vacuum left by the collapsed order. Warlords, cartels, charismatic tyrants. The tools of control are simply seized by new hands. The cycle repeats, darker and more brutal than before. In another version, what emerges is transformation. Communities recognize the opening, not as a return to chaos, but as a return to possibility. They gather, they teach, they remember how to organize themselves. They re-establish trust, not through surveillance, but through covenant. And in doing so, they begin to rebuild not what was, but what could have been, a society structured around mutual responsibility, interdependence, and dignity. History offers examples of both. The Soviet collapse produced both democratic experiments and kleptocratic empires. The fall of Weimar brought both worker councils and fascist consolidation. Reversion is a doorway, not a destination. It does not care who walks through it. It only clears the path. That is why this moment is not one of mere observation. It is a time of teaching. Understanding reversion is not enough. We must equip people with the logic of what comes next. The old system ran on reinforcement, the endless loop of fear, favoritism, and consolidation. The new must run on a different logic, one rooted in coherence, humility, and balance. And this logic must be taught not as doctrine, but as structure, as triads of meaning, action, and restoration. Reversion is already upon us. The system has overreached, its foundations are cracking. What remains is the question of what will rise in its place. That answer does not rest in algorithms or policy or force. It rests in the people and in whether they can come to see themselves, not as victims of collapse, but as agents of recreation. Human agency and understanding through logic. There is no romance in collapse. Not in Rome, where civic decay and military overreach left farmers landless, cities lawless, and the hungry fighting in the streets over stale grain. Not in France, where revolution devoured its own children in the name of liberty. Not in Weimar Germany, where a paper mark became less valuable than kindling, and people who once made violins now sold their furniture for bread. And not in Rwanda or Yugoslavia or Iraq, where collapse did not free the people but fractured them into opposing camps of blood and memory. Collapse at its worst does not create freedom. It creates scapegoats. It unleashes suspicion. It hardens identities and breaks supply chains. It turns neighbors into competitors, then into enemies. Not because they are evil, but because the social fabric that once mediated fear, scarcity and difference is no longer there. When control fails, the first response is not cooperation, it is blame. Blame because someone must be responsible. Someone must be cheating the system. Someone must be sabotaging our jobs, our food, our nation. The narrative does not need to be true, it only needs to give the desperate a target. This is what the collapse of legitimacy looks like, not a clean break, but a long, simmering reversal of trust. First in institutions, then in systems, then in each other. When Rome fell, it didn't end with a final battle. It ended with fragmentation, the bureaucracies broke, the armies scattered, and ordinary people turned to the nearest lord or bishop who could offer bread and a wall. Autonomy didn't emerge, feudalism did. When the Soviet Union collapsed, it birthed a black market and a class of oligarchs. Lifespans dropped, alcoholism soared, former engineers sold cigarettes on the street. These are the patterns, not just loss but division, not just hardship but persecution. In every major civilizational breakdown, we see this sequence: disorientation, disconnection, conflict, regression. And we must be honest with ourselves, it can happen again. The myth that we've come too far is just that, a myth. Systems fail when they become extractive, beyond repair, when trust erodes faster than it can be rebuilt, and when people have no framework to interpret the chaos. But here is where our moment differs. We live in a world not just of networks, but of mirrors. We can see what is happening, not in fragments passed down through rumor, but in real time across borders and languages. We can talk to one another, publish, translate, compare. We can replay history at high speed and measure its patterns. More importantly, we have tools, not weapons, but structures of thought, capable of naming dynamics that past civilizations only experienced blindly. We can model feedback loops. We can map reinforcing systems. We can identify when control tightens into fragility, when authority loses legitimacy, and when exclusion breeds rupture. The only thing missing, the only remaining bottleneck, is comprehension. Not education in the traditional sense. Comprehension, the ability to perceive relationships, to recognize structural failure, to see that what feels personal may be systemic, and to act accordingly. Most people don't lack intelligence, they lack framing. They feel the system squeezing, but they don't see its skeleton. They react to symptoms because the architecture is invisible. That's why understanding matters, not as an intellectual exercise, but as a matter of survival. If people can't name the collapse, they will misread it. If they misread it, they will turn on each other. If they turn on each other, the future will look like the worst of the past. But if they can see, if even a critical fraction begins to understand the patterns, they can respond before the spiral tightens. They can recognize bottlenecks, not as failures of character, but as structural consequences. They can stop demanding scapegoats and start demanding coherence. They can rebuild trust where institutions cannot. They can lay down the foundations of new systems before the old ones collapse entirely. This doesn't require a central plan. It doesn't require utopian blueprints. It requires the spread of structural literacy, of frameworks that help people see loops, dependencies, leverage points. Triadic logic is one of these tools, not because it is ancient or moral or elegant, but because it works. Because it makes the invisible visible, because it turns events into systems and fear into foresight. And foresight is what gives us a chance not to prevent collapse entirely, but to keep it from taking everything with it. We do not live in the Dark Ages. We have technologies, networks, access to knowledge that no prior civilization possessed. The only thing separating us from another age of ruin is whether we learn how to see. We are not too late. But we are close. The choice now is not between collapse and order. That choice is gone. The choice is between reversion into tragedy or transition into something newly coherent. And coherence begins with understanding. Understanding begins with structure. And structure begins when someone, anyone, learns to see.